Okay, members, thank you very much. And we are moving now to agenda item 11, which is a raise briefing on the Sign Language Bill. So members, a copy of the research paper is at page 380. And I now welcome to our meeting Karen McCallion and Aidan Stennett to the meeting this morning. So Karen, I believe it is yourself who is giving the initial opening statement, so please go ahead and do that for members.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, members, and thanks for your time today. So as members of the Assembly's Research and Information Service, Aidan Stennett and I will provide an overview of the Sign Language Bill as introduced to the Assembly on the 10th of February. We'll each brief the committee on the details of the raised bill paper, which is on page 381 of your packs, and then we'll both take questions after Aidan has briefed you on the financial implications of the bill. To assist the committee in examining the bill, our briefing aims to highlight key legislative provisions, implementation considerations and comparisons with similar legislation in Great Britain and Ireland. And we should also explore potential areas for further consideration in terms of consultation, practical implementation and enforcement. So the bill is potentially a significant step for sign language users in Northern Ireland as it aims to enhance accessibility, cultural recognition and legal rights. However, as implementation success depends on the effective policy execution and stakeholder engagement, we'll focus on these areas in our research briefing. The Sign Language Bill is described as an enabling bill, meaning that the details are left to delegated or secondary legislation, and that'll be through regulations. This potentially raises questions about oversight and clarity in terms of how those provisions will be applied in practice. So the absence of detailed provisions on implementation potentially raises some areas for further scrutiny, such as the extent to which the bill enhances sign language rights beyond the existing disability legal frameworks, and whether the reliance on the regulations provides sufficient clarity on public sector obligations. In terms of consultation and community engagement, the last public consultation on DFC's sign language framework, which included draft bill proposals, that took place in 2016. The Sign Language Partnership Group has been involved in the development of the bill, but they do not currently have a statutory advisory role. Therefore, members may wish to consider whether the absence of a more formal consultation process could impact the bill's effectiveness, as well as how DFC will ensure continued engagement with more than one representative of the deaf community beyond the passage of the bill as well. In terms of why the bill is important, unlike other linguistic minority groups, deaf individuals must navigate disability frameworks for basic communication rights. The bill shifts the approach towards linguistic and cultural rights, aligning Northern Ireland with best practices from neighbouring jurisdictions. However, the absence of enforcement mechanisms may require further consideration, as does the practical implications of moving sign language rights out of a disability framework and how public bodies will be held accountable if accessibility obligations are not met. To give a bit of context in terms of the considerations of some of the real-world challenges of sign language accessibility, according to a Health and Social Care Board evaluation report that was published in 2021, in healthcare, deaf patients can experience delays in accessing interpreters, which can affect their ability to give informed consent, and a reliance on remote communication services may put vulnerable groups at further risk of not engaging with health services. An education survey report by the Consortium for Research in Deaf Education for 2023-24 detailed a 38% decrease of qualified teachers of deaf children between the years of 2011 and 2024, and that the number of children reported as deaf increased from 1,238 in 2011 to 1,603 by 2024. In terms of employment, deaf applicants and workers may struggle to access interpreters for job interviews or workplace training. And a 2019 report about access to justice for deaf people in Northern Ireland, the police officers and legal professionals interviewed as part of that survey believed that deaf people were less likely to use legal services such as solicitors and less likely to report crime than hearing people. And in terms of public services, difficulties in terms of the consistency of access to real-time sign language interpretation through local councils has also been evidenced as well. So members may wish to consider whether the bill should include minimum standards for accessibility in key sectors such as healthcare and education and justice, and the extent to which existing public sector accessibility gaps have been assessed by the department before the drafting of the bill. In terms of key provisions of the bill that will draw members' attention to today, Clause 1 details the official recognition of BSL and ISL, and the bill then grants official status to both BSL and ISL, and more details about that's on page 395 of your packs. In terms of Clause 3, the duty on prescribed organisations to take reasonable steps to provide information and services. Although services are to be provided at no extra cost to sign language users, this clause also takes into account affordability and practicability, and there again more detail on that on page 399. Clause 5 sets out that the Department for Communities is to issue guidance where the meaning of reasonable steps is to be left to departmental guidance rather than being defined in the legislation. And then clauses 7 and 8 set out the procedures for DFC to make regulations, and members may wish to consider how this may limit scrutiny both for this bill and in the future, and that's detailed from page 405. Clause 9 requires the Department for Communities to publish a report every 5 years, and Clause 10 provides for accreditation of BSL and ISL teachers and interpreters, and different types of teachers, such as teachers of early years and teachers of deaf children, are not explicitly differentiated in the bill. So potential areas for consideration may include whether the bill provides sufficient clarity on public sector responsibilities, the level of scrutiny, the use of delegated legislation through the use of regulation offers members of the Assembly, and the extent to which departmental guidance will ensure consistent service provision. In terms of the cultural and social recognition, the bill's provisions recognise deaf people as a cultural and linguistic minority by moving away from a medical model of deafness and supporting the promotion of deaf culture and identity. So the bill therefore adopts a cultural and social model of deafness which aligns with international best practices. The absence of funding commitments that Aidan will describe in more detail in his presentation, and the absence of structured obligations for cultural promotion is also notable as well. So potential areas for further consideration might include whether the bill should contain a statutory duty for cultural promotion and the alignment of the bill with other government strategies on minority languages. So in terms of comparisons with GB in Ireland, which you'll find a comparative table between pages 433 and 435 in your packs, it sets out a comparison of the clauses in the Northern Ireland Sign Language Bill with similar acts in Scotland, Ireland and GB. And so, for example, concerning promotion, Northern Ireland's bill follows Scotland's and Ireland's models, but it does not include some of the enforceability measures that are in both the Irish and the Scottish Sign Language Acts. So where Ireland mandates for free ISL interpretation in public services, and Scotland requires a national planning framework, and compare that then to the GB BSL Act, which focuses more on promotion than enforceability of accessibility rights. So the Northern Ireland sort of sits in the middle between those examples. So potential areas for then consideration might be that the potential benefits of statutory sign language services similar to Ireland, and whether a national strategy as used in Scotland could support the implementation process. So in terms of public sector obligations, the bill does not specify which public bodies will be subject to accessibility duties. This will be determined by future regulations. Public bodies may interpret reasonable steps differently, leading to inconsistencies in service provision in terms of how that's noted in different individual sign language action plans. And there's no penalty or enforcement mechanism if a public body fails to comply. So potential considerations might be whether the bill should include explicit statutory obligations for public bodies, and the risks associated with leaving compliance entirely to departmental guidance might also require further consideration as well. In terms of Clause 9, which is on page 410 of your packs, the 5-yearly reporting and evaluation This requires DFC to publish a report every 5 years, but there's no specific evaluation metrics included in the bill. So compared to other jurisdictions, in terms of the timing of that cycle, in England and Wales, after an initial annual period of reporting, it's a three-yearly reporting process, and for Scotland, it's 6-year cycle. Ireland, it was 3 years after the Act was first enacted, and then 5 years thereafter. The Northern Ireland Bill has the 5-year reporting cycle, but it doesn't specify what data should be collected. During the second stage debate, the Minister indicated an openness to a shorter initial reporting cycle. So potential further considerations might include whether evaluation metrics should be specified and the advantages of shorter initial review cycles to ensure early assessment of implementation challenges. So then in terms of education and language promotion, the bill promotes early year sign language education, but does not establish a long-term strategy for teacher training. So potential areas for consideration may be the extent to which future teaching resources have been planned for or modelled by the department in terms of supporting the provision of sign language classes, and the level of coordination with the Education Authority as well on sign language provision. Clause 10 then, it details the accreditation of teachers and interpreters. That's on page 414 of the PACS. The bill introduces mandatory accreditation, but the process and enforcement mechanisms aren't specified. So in 2004, there were 5 qualified interpreters in Northern Ireland, and this has increased to 39 in 2025. So in education, over 1,600 children rely on just under a total of 50 qualified teachers of the deaf. So the negative resolution procedure means that regulations on accreditation could be changed without full debate, and so therefore potential scrutiny points might be the sufficiency of teacher and interpreter training resources to meet demand, and whether a statutory review of interpreter and teacher numbers should be included in the bill. Then in terms of enforcement and compliance, the bill relies on voluntary compliance from public bodies. Ireland's ISL Act allows legal recourse if public bodies fail to provide interpretation services. The absence of an explicit complaints mechanism may leave sign language users without a means to challenge non-compliance. And so their considerations might be whether the bill should introduce an independent monitoring body and a need for clear accountability mechanisms for public bodies. So challenges in implementation, the bill leaves many of the details to delegated or secondary legislation through resolution, meaning that scrutiny will be limited after the bill's passed. The discretionary nature of reasonable steps may lead to unequal access across different public bodies, and the shortage of trained professionals may limit the bill's effectiveness in practice. So considerations might be the extent to which DFC will monitor and intervene if public bodies do not comply, and whether mandatory compliance checks should be included in the legislation. So to summarise, the bill provides important recognition but raises questions about enforceability, and the effectiveness of the bill will depend on its implementation and supporting regulations. So considerations might be the impact of the bill on public services and accessibility, and Aidan will detail this further in his presentation. And then other considerations might be how ongoing monitoring and accountability can be ensured, and whether additional safeguards may be needed to ensure effective delivery. So thanks very much, and I'll let Aidan take it from here.
Thank you, Karen. So as Karen set out, I'll move on to look at some of the public purse implications of the bill, and the commentary on that begins on page 414 of your packs. Just to note the public finance context that this bill is being brought forward in. The committee would have heard from the department earlier about how challenging that context is, and it's also a time when there's an increased focus across the executive on budget sustainability. So within that context, the AFM includes limited financial information. It notes that the bill is an enabling bill, stating that it will have no immediate financial implications, but the cost could be incurred in the future when the department uses the powers that the bill provides it with. As Karen has noticed, the bill provides the department with powers to make regulations in 3 key areas. That's the list of prescribed organisations, details of the accreditation scheme for translators and teachers, and for the purposes that the department considers appropriate. As I've said, the AFM notes that using these powers may incur costs, but provides no indication of what those might be. And then the bill's reliance on secondary legislation may limit the committee's capacity to scrutinise those costs in the future. At this point, there are a number of knowns that provide indications of the potential impact of the bill on the public purse, but there are also some unknowns that ensure a full assessment of that impact is not possible at this time. So in evidence to the committee on the 6th of February, the department noted that it spent about around £500,000 per year on current programmes for the deaf community. In the same evidence session, the department stated that it would argue for a decent amount of funding, but added that not very much is needed to make a profound difference. Again, in that evidence, to the committee, the departments suggested that the bill would have implications across the public sector. Against this, there are a number of unknowns. As noted, we don't know which public bodies are to be designated as prescribed organisations, nor do we know the full contents of the guidance those organisations will be required to follow. In addition, it's unclear at this point to what extent public bodies currently provide information and services to the deaf community in an accessible way. So we do not know the level of improvement that will be needed to take them up to the standards that the legislation will require, and the costs associated with making that improvement. There's also some uncertainty to the number of BSL and ISL users in Northern Ireland. The AFM relies on a 2015 estimate of at least 5,000 sign language users. And in February, the department told the committee that they, I quote, struggle to determine definitive numbers, and that in turn makes it difficult to determine budget numbers. Finally, it's unclear how prescribed bodies will interpret the term reasonable steps when discharging the duties under the bill, and how this interpretation will impact any costs. So that's all I wanted to cover. Apologies, I've probably raised more questions than answers, but we're happy to take questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Karen, and thank you, Aidan. And I want to say in the first instance, and using some of my learning from the taster session, that I support the sign languages bill. However, and I thank you for the detail in your presentation, and it has touched on a lot of points that my own reading of the bill has picked up upon. This is a bill with significant, what are known as Henry VIII powers, and that I have to say is something that I think we will have to consider. I was particularly concerned around the kind of condition of affordability and practicability, and that the potential of that to hollow out the entire impact of the bill. I had concerns around the public bodies and how those were being identified, particularly ongoing. I had concerns also, like yourselves, around the engagement ongoing. It seemed very limited. I think it referred to one person or one organisation, which seemed pretty basic to me. So I think that's something we will want to look about. The review period, and as you say, the Minister did highlight that he would want to that he may be open to looking at that review period, because this is an issue that it's been waited for so long. We don't want to delay any tweaks that need to be made or changes. So I think you have set out a number of things there that I think tally, and a number of things that I hadn't. So I really do appreciate your input on that. Brian, go ahead.
Yep. Look, a very helpful raised paper as always. You highlight it's about linguistic and cultural rights, not as a disability accommodation, and it's also just highlighting it's about quality of communication, and as you say, like people, if they're requiring engagement with law and order agencies or with solicitor, just to ensure the high quality of communication. Concerned if prescribed organisations aren't actually defined. I think there's reference to all Northern Ireland departments and public bodies, but what beyond that? That's a fundamental, and all reasonable steps, as you say, that's going to be open to interpretation, and the lack of enforcement legislation obviously, a lot of this will take time to roll out the consequences of this. So I don't know. At some stage, will there be? I don't see it in your paper. Examples of what is done elsewhere. In terms, I expect that technology will play a significant role in the implementation of this. Realistically, you're not going to have an Irish and British Sign Language person standing in every public building in case somebody comes in. I'm sure that it'll have to be a service that can be accessed online. So if we can get at some stage some examples of what is done elsewhere.
Just to flag, Brian, there is
there
some information provided. It's a page
433.
Page 433 of your pack, just for
Okay.
to look back on. And of course, other areas might arise, and we can seek further raise input. It should, but at page 433 of your pack, there is a table for a number of pages there. There's a number of other jurisdiction comparators.
Okay. No, I'll get a look at that. Probably like to see a bit more, practical examples, of and I do wonder. There's wording I haven't. It says somewhere about that services are equally accessible in sign language as they are in English or in other languages, and as a legal term, is that what is in the legislation elsewhere? Because it could be argued that unless you have somebody standing there who can do ISL or BSL, you're not providing something which is equally accessible.
In the other jurisdictions, there's quite different approaches. So for the BSL Act in GB, it's really focusing on essentially government communications and the reports as well. That there's links for in the paper are really looking at how the amount of communications have been increased in terms of being translated to BSL. But then in terms of the Irish Act, free interpretation is for all public bodies, that's mandated within the Act. So and then with the Scottish Act, that has really been implemented through national plans. So there is a national plan created by the Scottish Government following the passing of the Act, and then each public bodies that are listed in a schedule at the back of the Act then were to provide their own national or their own plan for sign language provision, and then that's reviewed every 6 years as well. But there's been one review of that so far, and it's all following a kind of a national framework. So it's sort of different approaches in each one. So in this it's different. But the Appendix 1, and it's in page 53 of my paper, but towards the back of
that's the one.
That's got the comparison of the different approaches to the legislation. So where the Northern Ireland bill is quite different in that it's an enabling bill, and most of the detail in terms of what you're going to see in a public body hasn't been, because we don't know which organisations. Obviously the departments are all mentioned, but we don't know beyond that, who this list of prescribed organisations are. So but in terms of how things are done in other jurisdictions, that what we tried to do is kind of refer to those through the paper under each clause where we had the information.
Okay, well, we'll have plenty of time to work through this anyway. Okay.
And I think we've got a taste of why we do need appropriate amount of time to work through there. It's a framework bill which will require a lot more fleshing out, I feel. Kelly?
Yeah, thank you very much. Reading through your paper, I was quite glad when I did my second stage that I had covered off quite a bit of stuff that you were raising concern about. Do we know anywhere else, because I have never heard of this used in legislation in my time here, prescribed organisations is used by anybody else?
I looked back through, the only thing that was coming up was something from the early 2000s, but even then it didn't set out, so the short answer is no, from what I could find. But
I felt that was what seemed to me like antiquated language that didn't really explain, and I'm a great believer in make it simple so that people can clearly understand what it is. The other thing I was going to say is there any money comparisons for the other legislators?
It's not something I looked at for this.
Yeah,
I was trying
okay.
to focus on
Yeah.
the immediate Northern Ireland impact, but it's certainly something we can go back and explore and see what's available for you.
Well, maybe see. It depends what we're going for, of course. The only other thing I wanted to ask about is, you see, it's gone out of my head now. What was that about? Yes, in the current legislation as provided, it says that the Department for Communities basically can't instruct another department to do things. Is that actually the case, or could we add things in? Because, for instance, we talk about Department for Communities has to provide classes. To be quite frank, the Department of Education should be providing classes as well. Is that a case that we couldn't amend and put something like that in?
I've not being a legal expert, I wouldn't be sure of how that would work. But I think what's interesting is it says that in one clause, and then in another it sort of says it isn't possible to instruct the other department. So that was another kind of ambiguity going through looking at the bill as a whole.
No, I thank you very much. And as always, the questions that are provided are fantastic. We have got a lot of stuff.
We can drill into some of that evidence with the bill clerk and the bill office, and we will be scheduling once we get our call for evidence. So I think that's valid and that support. And indeed, we may be back to yourselves for some. I have a feeling we may be back to yourselves for some information in the meantime. But for now, that's a really, really good start. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, members. So.
Lost quorum.
Yep, so we've lost quorum, so we can't take any decisions as such, but we're very close to the end of our meeting in any case. So members, any follow-up actions then on that one? Okay, so we'll move on now.
I can't agree on anything.
Yeah.
We'll note the forward.
Yeah. So in relation to agenda item 12 forward work programme, it's contained at page 440. You'll note that following last week's meeting, a briefing in relation to the NI Football Fund has been added in for next week. Are members otherwise content to note the forward work programme?
Yes.
Yep. Any other business? Do members have any other business to wish to raise today? No, thank you. Date, time and location of next meeting, members. Our next meeting will be at 10 a.m. on Thursday, 6th of March in room 29, and the meeting is now adjourned. Thank you very much.
Committee Room 29. Sound.